On a bright spring morning, as the sun painted the Atlanta airport in warm golden hues, a young, successful marketing executive was preparing for what should have been just another business flight. 8 months pregnant with her first child, she had taken extra care that morning, arriving early, double-checking her doctor's travel clearance letter, and making sure she had everything needed for a comfortable journey to Chicago. The familiar buzz of the airport terminal surrounded her as she made her way through security. Being a frequent flyer, she knew every corner of this airport like the back of her hand. The smell of fresh coffee from the airport cafes mixed with the excitement of travel filled the air. Other travelers rushed past, dragging their wheeled suitcases across the polished floor, while airport announcements echoed through the terminal. Despite her advancing pregnancy, she moved with practiced ease through the terminal. Her baby bump was proudly visible under her crisp navy blue blazer, and she couldn't help but smile every time she felt a little kick. She had been traveling for work throughout her pregnancy, always taking proper precautions and following her doctor's advice. This trip was particularly important. It would be one of her last business meetings before starting maternity leave. As she approached her gate, she noticed families with young children, elderly couples, and business people all waiting for the same flight. She checked her phone one last time, responding to a few work emails and sending a quick message to her partner about her safe arrival at the gate. The boarding process began smoothly, with the gate agent warmly greeting passengers as they showed their boarding passes. Being in first class, she was among the first group called to board. She had earned this comfort through years of loyal flying with the airline, accumulating countless miles during her business trips. As she walked down the jet bridge, she mentally prepared for the 2-hour flight ahead, planning to review some presentation materials while enjoying the comfortable seating. The aircraft's interior welcomed her with its familiar sense of possibility. Each flight represented not just a journey, but new opportunities and connections. She could already picture herself settling into her seat, perhaps chatting with an interesting seatmate, or simply enjoying some quiet time above the clouds. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly as she felt another kick, and she whispered softly to her unborn child about their little adventure together. The first-class cabin looked inviting with its wide, leather seats and extra legroom, a comfort she particularly appreciated now in her 8th month. Other passengers were already settling in, storing their bags and preparing for departure. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, helping with bags and offering pre-flight beverages to those already seated. As she approached her assigned seat, she pulled out her boarding pass, ready to show it as usual. Everything was perfectly normal until that moment, just another day in the life of a traveling professional. Little did she know that in the next few minutes, this routine flight would turn into an eye-opening experience that would spark a national conversation about bias and discrimination in air travel. She reached a seat, 2D, a window spot she had specifically chosen for extra comfort. Just as she was about to sit down, she noticed one flight attendant watching her with an unusual intensity. Something about that gaze felt different from the typical crew-passenger interaction, but she brushed it off, choosing to focus instead on getting comfortable for the flight ahead. Looking out the window at the bustling tarmac below, she took a deep breath, enjoying these last few moments of calm before what would soon become one of the most memorable flights of her life, though not for any of the reasons she could have expected. The morning sun still streamed through the small oval window, casting a warm glow across her seat as the other passengers continued boarding behind her, completely unaware of the dramatic events about to unfold. The flight attendant's footsteps seemed unusually deliberate as she approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again." The pregnant executive reached for her pass, though she'd already shown it during boarding just moments ago. She'd flown hundreds of times before, but something felt different about this interaction. "Is there a problem?" she asked quietly, handing over the boarding pass for the second time. The flight attendant examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if checking for watermarks. Other passengers in first class were being served their pre-flight beverages, but the attendant remained focused solely on questioning her presence. "Are you sure this is your seat?" the flight attendant pressed, despite the boarding pass clearly showing seat 2D. Her tone carried an implication that made the executive's heart sink. She'd heard this kind of skepticism before, though rarely so blatantly. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, watching the interaction with growing concern. The executive took a deep breath, remaining professional despite the growing discomfort. "Yes, this is my seat. I'm a frequent flyer with the airline. Platinum status, actually." She pulled out her frequent flyer card, hoping this additional proof would end the questioning. Instead, it seemed to agitate the flight attendant further. "Well, I'll still need to verify this with the gate agent," the attendant announced loudly, making no effort to lower her voice. By now, several other passengers had stopped their pre-flight routines to watch the scene unfold. The executive could feel her baby moving, responding to her rising stress levels, and she placed a gentle hand on her belly, trying to stay calm. A kind-faced older woman in the seat behind her leaned forward. "I've been watching this whole thing," she whispered supportively. "Don't worry, we all see what's happening here." The simple act of solidarity provided a moment of comfort in the increasingly tense situation. The flight attendant returned, this time with a different attitude, somehow even more confrontational than before. "The gate agent confirmed your boarding pass, but I'll be keeping an eye on you during this flight." The threat in her voice was barely veiled, and a murmur of disapproval rippled through the nearby passengers. As other flight attendants moved through the cabin with their usual pre-flight service, this particular attendant made a point of repeatedly passing by 2D, each time finding some reason to scrutinize the executive's seat area. When the executive politely requested a glass of water, the attendant's response was immediate and hostile. "You'll have to wait," she snapped, despite having just served drinks to other first-class passengers. The executive noticed her hands had begun to shake slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity and injustice of the situation. She'd earned her place in that seat through years of hard work and countless miles of business travel. Yet here she was, being treated like an unwelcome intruder. The cabin continued to fill with the usual pre-flight sounds, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of safety cards, the soft chatter of passengers settling in. But around seat 2D, there was a growing bubble of tension. Other passengers exchanged knowing glances, some pulling out their phones, seemingly ready to document any further incidents. A gentleman in a business suit across the aisle finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he called to another flight attendant passing by. "I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant about the treatment I'm witnessing." His intervention marked a turning point. Other passengers began to voice their concerns as well, their collective murmurs growing louder. The pregnant executive sat quietly, maintaining her dignity despite the humiliation being directed at her. She'd faced subtle discrimination before in her corporate career, but this was different. This was happening in front of a plane full of witnesses, none of whom could deny the clear bias they were seeing. As the final boarding announcements were made, the tension in first class had reached a breaking point. The flight attendant's behavior had crossed a line that would soon have consequences far beyond this flight. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a situation that would eventually make national headlines and spark an important conversation about prejudice in the airline industry. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when things took another turn. The pregnant executive's simple request for water had somehow become the spark that would ignite an even more troubling situation. She'd been patient, professional, and calm throughout the initial confrontation, but now her throat was dry, and her doctor had emphasized the importance of staying hydrated during the flight. "Excuse me," she called out softly as the flight attendant passed by yet again. "Could I please have that glass of water now?" She kept her voice gentle, conscious of not wanting to disturb other passengers. The baby gave a little kick, as if adding its own quiet protest to the situation. The flight attendant spun around, her face twisted with barely concealed contempt. "I'd already told you you'll have to wait," she practically hissed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We're very busy with service right now." This statement was puzzling to everyone in first class, as the other flight attendants had already finished their initial service, and most passengers were quietly enjoying their drinks. A businessman 2 rows ahead turned around, his brow furrowed with concern. "She's been waiting for 20 minutes, he pointed out, "and I can see you've served everyone else." His intervention seemed to further agitate the flight attendant, who was now standing with her hands on her hips, creating a scene in the middle of the aisle. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" she snapped at him. The businessman raised his eyebrows in surprise but held his ground. "No, I'm simply pointing out what everyone here can see happening." More passengers began to stir in their seats, many now openly watching the confrontation unfold. The executive felt her cheeks burning, not from embarrassment, but from a growing sense of injustice. She'd spent years in corporate environments learning to handle difficult situations with grace, but this was testing her limits. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "I'm just asking for water. I'm pregnant, and my doctor says I need to stay hydrated during flights." Instead of responding to this reasonable explanation, the flight attendant pulled out her phone and began rapidly typing. "I'm documenting your disruptive behavior," she announced loudly. "You're being aggressive and making other passengers uncomfortable." This bizarre accusation caused an immediate reaction throughout the cabin. An elderly woman a few rows back called out, "That's absolutely not true. We can all see who's being disruptive here." Several passengers had already pulled out their phones, recording the interaction with concerned expressions. A well-dressed woman in a business suit stood up from her seat. "I'm an HR director," she announced firmly, "and I feel compelled to say that this treatment appears discriminatory. Would you like my business card for future reference?" The offer hung in the air like a challenge, making the flight attendant's face flush red. The pregnant executive remained seated, one hand protectively over her belly, the other gripping her armrest. She'd faced subtle prejudice before. The questioning looks in high-level meetings, the double takes when she walked into executive lounges, but this was different. This was happening in front of dozens of witnesses, all of whom could clearly see the unfair treatment unfolding before their eyes. Another flight attendant, noticing the commotion, quickly approached with a bottle of water. "Here you are, ma'am," she said kindly, shooting a concerned look at her colleague. But before the executive could even say thank you, the first flight attendant intercepted the bottle. "She's been flagged as disruptive," she declared, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "We can't serve her anything else during this flight." The absurdity of this statement caused several passengers to gasp audibly. A young man in the row behind pulled out his laptop and began typing rapidly, later revealed to be composing an email to the airline's customer service. The tension in the cabin had become almost unbearable. Other crew members exchanged worried glances, clearly uncomfortable with their colleagues' behavior, but unsure how to intervene. The pregnant executive sat quietly, maintaining her composure even as she felt her baby responding to her stress with increased movement. Just then, the flight attendant made an announcement that would turn this already tense situation into a full-blown crisis. Speaking into her crew phone, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Yes, I need to report an unruly passenger in first class. We may need law enforcement to meet the aircraft." The cabin erupted in protests. Multiple passengers now stood up, phones recording, voices raised in objection to this blatant abuse of power. The pregnant executive remained seated, her hand still protectively cradling her belly as the situation around her spiraled toward a confrontation that would soon make headlines across the country. The plane descended back toward the airport, cutting the flight short by the flight attendant's demand. In the tense cabin, phones continued recording as the pregnant executive sat quietly, both hands now resting on her belly as if to shield her unborn child from the stress of the situation. The other passengers had formed an impromptu support network, their voices rising in protest against what they were witnessing. "I've been flying this route for 15 years, announced a distinguished-looking man in a gray suit, standing up despite the seatbelt sign. "This is the most unprofessional behavior I've ever seen from airline staff." Several others nodded in agreement, some typing furiously on their phones, others already on social media sharing what they were witnessing. The plane touched down with an unusual urgency, and as it taxied to the gate, the executive could see several police vehicles through her window, their lights flashing in the afternoon sun. Her heart was racing, but she maintained her composure, years of corporate experience helping her stay calm in this crisis. "We're all witnesses," said the kind-faced woman behind her, reaching forward to pat her shoulder. "Don't worry, we won't let them twist the story." Around the cabin, other passengers were exchanging contact information, many of them professionals who understood the gravity of what they'd observed. When the aircraft door opened, 2 police officers boarded, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene. But before they could reach the executive seat, something unexpected happened. A man in the front row stood up, pulling out a legal badge. "I'm a civil rights attorney," he stated firmly, "and I've been recording this entire incident. Before you take any action, you need to know that dozens of passengers here have witnessed clear discrimination against this pregnant passenger." The officers paused, taking in the scene. Nearly every passenger was now standing, phones out, faces determined. A woman in a business suit stepped forward. "I'm a corporate diversity trainer," she announced. "What we've witnessed here today is textbook discriminatory behavior, and I've documented everything." More passengers began speaking up, each one adding their professional credentials and observations to the growing chorus of support. The pregnant executive finally spoke, her voice steady despite the situation. "I just wanted a glass of water," she explained to the officers. "I'm 8 months pregnant, and my doctor says staying hydrated during flights is crucial. I have all my medical documentation and flight documents right here." She reached for her bag, movements slow and deliberate. The officers exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. One of them spoke into his radio, while the other began taking statements from nearby passengers. The flight attendant who had caused the incident stood near the galley, her earlier confidence visibly shaken as passenger after passenger came forward with their accounts. "I have the whole thing on video," said a young tech professional, holding up his phone, including the part where she denied water to a pregnant woman and falsely accused her of being aggressive. Others chimed in with their recordings, creating an undeniable record of what had transpired. An older gentleman who had been quietly observing spoke up. "I'm a retired judge," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "And what I've witnessed here today isn't just poor customer service, it's a clear case of discrimination that needs to be addressed at the corporate level." The police officers, after interviewing several passengers and reviewing multiple recordings, approached the executive. Their tone was respectful, apologetic even. "Ma'am, we can see there's been a serious misunderstanding here. Would you like to file a complaint about your treatment?" The other passengers watched intently as she considered her response. This moment had become bigger than just one flight. It was an opportunity to address a systemic issue that affected countless travelers. With quiet dignity, she began sharing her experience with the officers, her voice steady as she recounted the events that had led to this moment. Meanwhile, airline supervisors had arrived at the gate, their faces grave as they took in the scene. Dozens of business professionals with their phones out, a pregnant woman being interviewed by police, and their own flight attendant looking increasingly isolated as the truth of the situation became clear. What had started as a routine flight had transformed into a powerful moment of communal stand against discrimination. The executive's simple request for water had unveiled an ugly bias, but it had also revealed the fundamental decency of ordinary people willing to stand up for what was right. Within hours of the incident, social media platforms were buzzing with first-hand accounts and video clips from the flight. The pregnant executive's story had struck a chord with people across the country, turning what could have been just another day of travel into a powerful moment of public awareness. "I couldn't believe my eyes," read one viral post from a business consultant who'd been on the flight. Attached to his message was a clear video showing the flight attendant's hostile behavior. Here was a pregnant professional woman, calmly asking for water, being treated like she didn't belong in first class. We all watched it happen, and we all knew exactly why. The retired judge who'd been on board wrote a detailed LinkedIn post that quickly gained traction in legal and corporate circles. "In my 30 years on the bench," he wrote, "I've seen many cases of discrimination, but rarely have I witnessed such a clear example, documented by dozens of witnesses, all of us ready to testify about what we saw." Support poured in from unexpected places. A flight attendant from another airline posted a tearful video defending the pregnant passenger. "This is not who we are," she insisted. "Most of us become flight attendants because we care about people. What happened on that flight goes against everything we stand for." The tech professional who'd recorded the incident shared his footage with a major news network after getting permission from the executive. The video showed the entire sequence, the repeated questioning of her ticket, the denial of water, the false accusations of aggression, and most importantly, the calm dignity with which she handled the situation. Back at the airport, more passengers had stayed behind to give statements. The corporate diversity trainer who'd spoken up during the flight was now giving interviews to local news stations. "What we witnessed today wasn't just about one flight attendant or one airline," she explained. "It's about the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination that happens every day in various settings." The civil rights attorney who'd intervened had already drafted a detailed account of the incident. The support from other passengers was extraordinary, he noted in a widely shared social media post. People from all walks of life, all backgrounds, came together to stand against this injustice. That's what made this situation different, the immediate, unified response from witnesses. Online comments flooded in from around the world. "This brought tears to my eyes, both the injustice and the way strangers stood up for her. As a business traveler, I've seen similar situations, but this time people didn't stay silent. The way she handled it with such grace under pressure, that's real strength." The story gained even more attention when a popular mommy blogger shared it with her millions of followers. "Imagine being 8 months pregnant just trying to do your job and being denied water because someone decided you didn't look like you belonged," she wrote. "This isn't just about one incident, it's about the daily experiences of so many people." Professional organizations began weighing in. The Association of Flight Attendants released a statement condemning discrimination and calling for better training. Business travel groups shared guidelines about passengers' rights. Civil rights organizations offered their support and resources. The pregnant executive's own professional network rallied around her. Fellow executives shared similar experiences they'd faced, turning her individual story into a catalyst for broader conversations about workplace discrimination in all its forms. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with messages of support from industry leaders and young professionals alike. Meanwhile, the videos continued to spread. Each new angle showed the same thing: a professional woman being harassed for no valid reason, maintaining her composure while those around her stepped up to help. The airline's social media accounts were overwhelmed with comments demanding action, not just about this incident, but about systemic changes to prevent similar situations. What made this story particularly powerful was how it resonated with so many different groups: business travelers who'd faced similar treatment, expectant mothers concerned about their rights, professionals of all backgrounds who'd encountered discrimination, and allies who wanted to know how to better support others in such situations. As evening fell on that eventful day, the story had already been picked up by major news networks. But more importantly, it had sparked countless conversations in homes, offices, and online forums about how to recognize and respond to discrimination when we see it. The incident had become more than just a viral moment, it was turning into a movement for change. The airline's corporate headquarters was buzzing with activity well into the night. Emergency meetings were called as videos of the incident spread across social media like wildfire. In the main conference room, executives huddled around screens, watching footage from multiple angles, their faces growing more concerned with each viewing. "Look at how many times she checked the same boarding pass," pointed out the head of customer service, replaying one clip. "And here, denying water to a pregnant passenger. This goes against every protocol we have." The room fell silent as they watched the scene unfold again, the injustice clear in high definition. Meanwhile, the airline's HR department had pulled the flight attendant's personnel file. What they found was troubling: a pattern of similar complaints that had somehow slipped through the cracks. Previous passengers had reported feeling discriminated against, but none of those incidents had been captured on video like this one. "We found 3 formal complaints from the past year alone," the HR director announced during an urgent video call. "All with similar patterns of behavior, all involving passengers of color in first class." The executives exchanged worried glances, knowing this revelation would only add fuel to the growing public relations crisis. The airline's social media team was overwhelmed with messages. Comments poured in from around the world. "My mother was treated the same way last month." "I'm a frequent flyer and I've seen this behavior before." "What are you going to do to make sure this never happens again?" In the security department, analysts were reviewing footage from multiple flights. They gathered statements from other crew members who had worked with the flight attendant in question. A picture began to emerge of someone who had repeatedly shown bias in their interactions with certain passengers. The pregnant executive's corporate travel history with the airline painted an impressive picture, Hundreds of flights, always professional, never a single incident. Other flight attendants came forward with stories of serving her on previous flights, describing her as a courteous and low-maintenance passenger. "I remember her from a flight last month," one flight attendant wrote in her statement. "She was pleasant, quiet, and thanked the crew multiple times. She's the kind of passenger we usually appreciate having in first class." These testimonials stood in stark contrast to the treatment she'd received on that fateful flight. The airline's training department was already drafting new materials, knowing they needed to address the systemic issues this incident had exposed. "We can't just treat this as one isolated incident," the training director insisted during a late-night meeting. "We need to completely overhaul how we prepare our staff to serve a diverse passenger population." Outside consultants were quickly brought in: diversity experts, civil rights attorneys, and customer service specialists. They began reviewing the airline's policies, looking for gaps that might have allowed discriminatory behavior to go unchecked. The process was thorough, examining everything from hiring practices to complaint procedures. The airline's CEO personally reviewed the footage late that night, his expression growing more troubled with each viewing. "This isn't just about one employee or one incident," he told his executive team. "This is about our entire culture and how we handle these situations. We need to make real changes." By midnight, the investigation had uncovered more than just the day's incident. There were systemic issues that needed addressing: gaps in training, holes in the complaint system, and a need for better oversight of staff behavior. The airline's leadership knew they needed to do more than just handle this one situation. They needed to prevent future incidents. The public relations team worked through the night, drafting statements and planning their response. But they knew that empty words wouldn't be enough. The public was watching, and they needed to show real, meaningful action. As dawn approached, the airline had made its decision. They would not only address this specific incident, but use it as a catalyst for broader change within the organization. The investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about their company culture, but it had also shown them a path forward. In the end, it wasn't just about one flight attendant or one passenger. It was about transforming an entire corporate culture to ensure every passenger felt welcome and respected, regardless of who they were or what seat they occupied. The airport buzzed with tension as cameras flashed and phones recorded every moment. Samantha stood there, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly, feeling a mix of exhaustion and determination. She never wanted to be a headline, never imagined herself at the center of a national conversation about racism. The airline's initial response was defensive. Corporate executives huddled in emergency meetings, reviewing security footage and passenger statements. But this time, things would be different. Social media had changed everything. Thousands of people were sharing her story, demanding accountability. Her phone began to ring constantly. News networks wanted interviews. Civil rights organizations reached out. Samantha was overwhelmed, but surprisingly calm. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind: "Stand tall, speak truth, and never let anyone make you feel small." Days turned into weeks. The investigation was thorough and intense. Passengers who witnessed the incident came forward, providing detailed accounts. The flight attendant's history was scrutinized, revealing a pattern of problematic behavior that had been overlooked for too long. When the final decision came, it was swift and clear. The airline terminated the flight attendant's employment, citing clear violations of their conduct policy. But for Samantha, it was never about getting someone fired. It was about creating change, about ensuring no other pregnant woman would experience such humiliation. The public apology from the airline was comprehensive. They committed to mandatory diversity training for all staff, promising a complete overhaul of their customer interaction protocols. Samantha was offered more than just compensation. She was offered a platform to make a real difference. Her pregnancy became a symbol of resilience. Each kick, each movement inside her seemed to say, "Mom, we're stronger together." She started speaking at conferences, sharing her experience not with anger, but with hope. Her story wasn't just about a terrible experience on a flight. It was about human dignity, about standing up when it's hard, about believing that things can get better. The media attention was intense, but Samantha managed it with grace. She worked with diversity consultants, helped design new training programs, and became an unexpected voice for change in the airline industry. When her daughter was born, she held her close and whispered, "We stand up. We speak out. We make the world a little better." The tiny baby looked up with eyes full of possibility, unaware of the storm her mother had weathered, but destined to inherit a world slightly more just because of her mother's courage. Epilogue. Years later, Samantha would look back on that day as a turning point, not just for herself, but for countless others who found strength in her story. The flight might have been just a few hours, but its impact would last a lifetime. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it had taken a step. And sometimes that's exactly what courage looks like, one step at a time.